Anyway, so platyhelminthes are flatworms, and then the other phylum is platyhelminthes. Those are the roundworms. Ashhelminthes, well, they're sometimes also called nemahelminthes or nematodes, and that's kind of a common name for this roundworm group. Now, these worms are highly adapted for life inside of a host organism. This is especially true of the flatworms, so they tend to have very poorly developed gastrointestinal. But then you think about it, what do you use your gastrointestinal system for? Obtaining nutrients, right? And when you take a meal, nutrients are absorbed through your gut wall, and those nutrients go into your bloodstream, and eventually the nutrients get to your muscle. Well, these organisms live inside the intestinal tract. They're in the lumen, so there's where the nutrients are initially. Some of these parasites live in blood vessels. That's another place where there's a lot of nutrient available. And then some of them go into muscle tissue, or they can go into other tissue. Again, their host has a pretty good nutrient supply, so these guys don't need a gastrointestinal system. Again, the flatworms, we're going to be looking at flukes. They have a kind of a partial GI system. They have a mouth. They have a little short GI tract that doesn't go anywhere. Tapeworms have nothing. Usually roundworms have a mouth at one end and an anus at the other end, but it's just a tube that runs through their body. They don't have the complex GI system that we have. Another feature, they have poorly developed nervous and muscular systems. But then again, think about what the nervous system is for. Typically, animals use their eyes, their ears, their sense of smell to detect possible predators coming on after them, or if they are predators, they're watching prey, and then they use their muscular system either to run away or to go after prey. We're talking about parasites hanging out in somebody's gut or bloodstream. They're not going anywhere. They're being carried around by their host. If there was a predator coming, they can't leave. They don't have any place to go. They're just going to be consumed along with the prey organism. So they don't really need a nervous system or a muscular system. The other thing they tend to have is a very well-developed reproductive system. These things have to be able to ensure that offspring will get to a new host. They're totally dependent upon their host if they're endoparasites. And so the endoparasites are going to have these rather complex life cycles. They produce extreme numbers of offspring so that at least some of them will survive, get into a new host. So we're going to be talking about some of these life cycles, and there are a few life cycles that you're supposed to know for the exam. Now, a lot of these flatworms are monoecious. The term literally means in one house, but what it means is they have both male and female reproductive systems in each individual. This term has come to be used with hermaphroditic. For a long time, the term hermaphroditic applied when an organism had external genitalia that were both male and female, but didn't necessarily have complete systems. Monoecious means they have complete reproductive systems. So the flatworms, this particular flatworm is a fluke. This fluke, about from here back, is reproductive system, and they have both male and female parts. Now, this gives the organisms a serious advantage because when they mate, two female systems are going to be fertilized. I don't know if you guys remember the Double Mint Gum commercials when they sang about double your pleasure, double your fun. Applies to organisms that are monoecious. When they get together, they also double their reproductive potential. Now, there are some flukes and most roundworms that are dioecious, and dioecious means they have separate sexes. So it's going to be male ones and female ones. These are asteroid worms over here, and so you can see female worms a little bit larger. Here's the male, and then this is the blood fluke that has male and female. They're actually separate, but the male, it's the male that's holding the female in a kind of a little glue, so they stay together. And then, beyond being oftentimes monoecious, sometimes dioecious, they tend to have these complex life cycles that involve more than one host. They don't all, but a lot of them do, and sometimes they will have multiple different hosts, And different hosts support different periods of the life cycle of the parasite. So the host in which the adult parasites live is called the definitive host. And typically the parasite is named based on the definitive host. So we're going to be talking about sheep liver flukes. Why are they called sheep liver flukes? Because sheep are the definitive host and they live in sheep livers. Do they only infect sheep? No. They'll infect deer, bear, dogs, people. But apparently they were first observed in sheep, and so that's why they get their name. Again, the definitive host is where the adult form of the parasite lives, also where sexual reproduction takes place. The alternate is called an intermediate host, and the intermediate host is where the larval stages occur, and very often asexual reproduction takes place. These terms can also be applied to protozoan parasites. So if you look at something like the Plasmodium, we said Plasmodium reproduces sexually in what stage? Do you remember? In mosquitoes. That's where syngaby happens. So according to this definition, the mosquito is the definitive host for Plasmodium. And humans are an intermediate host where asexual reproduction, schizogony, takes place. Now, there's significant advantages to having offspring and adults in slightly different environments. So we can look at it from the viewpoint of the parasite itself. One, if you have adults and offspring in different hosts or in different places, then there's less competition. They're not competing against one another for food or living space. You can think about, if you have children, you can relate to this. As they grow up and they begin to want money, they want to use the car, they have their stuff all over the house. It's like, really, could you just package them up and ship them to Chicago? It would be different. You would have less competition. So the parasites are taking advantage of this. Another feature is because they're in separate environments, there's potentially less damage to the host. And as I said, parasites really don't want to damage their host too much, because if the host dies, they're in big trouble. They're going to die also. A third advantage, the population is dispersed, so they're spread out in the environment. This means if something happens to one part of the population, you're not going to wipe out the entire population. If they're endoparasites, they're in multiple different animal hosts. 2 or 3 animal hosts could die, but you're still going to have parasites in some animals, plus you have offspring someplace else. Now, we're going to be looking at examples of some significant parasites. This is just an introductory class, so we can't cover all the parasites that exist, and believe me, there are plenty. Lots of parasites. Basically, what we look at is whatever was in the slide box. We haven't added to the slide box for quite some time, so yep, that's what we have. Our first example is Phaseola hepatica. This is the sheep liver fluke. Hepatic means liver, so Phaseola hepatica is named for the liver. The sheep, again, is the definitive host. So that's where you would find the adult forms of the parasite. They're in the liver. They can move around a little bit. And sometimes they can be detected with various types of scans. And then if people aren't familiar with parasites, they might be thought to be something other than a parasite. Anyway, they are monoecious. So the females, both female reproductive systems are fertilized when the organisms mate. You can see an egg that's produced there. Eggs are going to be released in fecal material. So they're going to go from the liver down the bile duct into the intestine. The eggs then, if they land in an appropriate environment, they have to land someplace that's fairly moist. They're going to hatch into a little larval stage called a meracidium. Notice meracidium is singular. If there's more than one, it's meracidia. So this is one meracidium. This thing looks a little bit like a paramecium. It's got a funny little bump on one end, but it is ciliated. Actually, it looks a lot like our paramecium prepared slides because you can't really see the cilia. Believe me, they have cilia, so they swim. So they're going to be swimming around and they're going to look for the intermediate host. For Phaseola hepatica, the intermediate host is a water snail. And a lot of these parasites have a particular species of water snail that they're looking for. When they find the snail, they burrow into the soft tissue, typically the antennae region on the snail. So they burrow in and they form a structure called a sporocyst. Sporocyst is basically a sac, but within that sac there are going to be stages of asexual reproduction. So they form a sporocyst first. That just shows the snail. Actually, it just shows you the snail shell because the snail's not in there at all. After the sporocyst is formed, inside the sporocyst there are other sacs that are called rediae. One is a redia, and inside each redia are multiple cercariae. Cercariae have tails, they look kind of like tadpoles. So there's 3 stages of asexual reproduction going on. Anyway, so this is the redia with cercariae inside. It's kind of hard to see them in there, but you can tell there's something in that sac. And then this is what the cercaria looks like. So it kind of has a little body with a tail on it. This is stained slightly differently, body and tail, so you can distinguish them. This is what's going to leave the snail. So they're going to go through the snail's tissue and out into the environment. They're going to get out into the water. They can swim around for a little bit. And then they're going to attach to vegetation. Their tail drops off, and what's left is just the little body part. It forms a kind of a dormant structure, and we've talked about the term cyst applying to the dormant stage of protozoa. The term cyst also applies to the dormant structure of this multicellular parasite. It'll just sit there, and what it's waiting for is a new host organism to come along and eat them. So they're going to eat the vegetation. The cyst gets consumed, it gets into the intestine, and then it leaves the intestine, and it goes through the gut wall and travels back to the liver to start the cycle over again. This is this is a fluke that has a tremendous reproductive potential when you think about those stages of asexual reproduction. So each female sheep liver fluke can produce about 500,000 eggs, which is a lot of eggs, but each egg can yield as many as 300 cercariae, because each egg goes into the intermediate coat, forms a sporocyst, and inside that you get multiple rediae, and inside each redia you get multiple cercariae. So they have a tremendous reproductive potential. If you think about it, and here again, this is the image of the sheep liver fluke. These things have a little mouth here, and this little tiny short intestine. It comes in here and it branches. Part of it goes over here and part of it goes down here. This is a sucker. They have a sucker up this end and a sucker here, but only about this much of this thing is GI tract, and it's a blind-ended GI tract. They just have a mouth and a little tiny bit of intestine, and everything behind that is reproductive system. So they have a tremendous reproductive potential. And again, this is essential because these things could die at various points along the pathway. So if the eggs leave the sheep and they land in an environment that's completely dry, the eggs won't hatch. Or if they hatched and the Meracidia started swimming and then the environment dried up, the Meracidia are going to die. Or they might be in an environment where they can swim around, but there's no intermediate host, the snail's not there. Or they could get into a snail and a crow comes by and eats it, and that's the end. That happens a lot. So they want to produce a very large number of offspring to guarantee that at least some of them survive to keep the parasite going. Now humans can contract Fasciola hepatica. You can get this by drinking water in a region where sheep are being grazed, because you could accidentally ingest the larval stage that has left the snail before it forms a cyst on grass. It's much more common in dogs and bears and deer and other kinds of animals, but humans can get it. And so here's some pictures of humans harvesting vegetation. What comes to my mind is watercress. I don't know if you guys ever eat watercress, but that used to be something that a lot of people would find kind of in wild meadows where there was water running through, and they would collect the watercress and then take it and make, they put it in a potato salad or put it in sandwiches. And when I learned about these parasites, it was like, okay, I won't be harvesting watercress anymore. Or at least not eating it raw. This is the life cycle. As you can see, this is from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. So it's showing the pathway as it would normally occur with sheep. But notice there's a cow in here, so this can be a parasite of other types of animals. From the sheep has the fluke in the liver, and then the flukes produce eggs. The eggs are released with the fecal material. They hatch into a merocydium, goes into the snail. Inside the snail, you have sporocyst, redia, cercariae. The cercariae come out, swim and attach to vegetation, which for some reason ended up on a spoon. Actually, that was so it could get into the human, but if it was just on vegetation that the cow or the sheep could eat, you can see how it's going to get back into that organ. And so humans are not the most common type of host, but they can be a host. Here's another fluke, the blood fluke. There are 3 different species that I know of. So Schistosoma is the genus. There's Schistosoma mansoni, japonicum, and hematobium. The reason they're called blood flukes is because the adults live inside blood vessels. They occupy different blood vessels, different regions of the body. For Schistosoma mansoni and japonicum, they're in the blood vessels associated with the gut. For Schistosoma hematobium, they're in blood vessels associated with the urinary bladder. This influences what kind of symptoms an individual would have if they were infected by these flukes, these blood flukes. Their life cycle is very similar to the sheep liver fluke, where you have definitive host, which in this case is human, and an intermediate host, which is a snail. There are a couple of differences in the life cycles. For one thing, the schistosome flukes don't have a redia stage. I'm not sure how that's determined because they have more than one sporocyst stage. So there has to be something, a difference between sporocyst and redia that I don't know about, because to me they look the same. But anyway, the other big difference is that when the cercariae are released from the snail, they're in the water and they burrow into the skin of their next host. These are human flukes, and people that are in water, fresh water, where these fluke larvae are present, the fluke larvae just burrow through the skin, so they can infect very readily. So once they get into the, once they burrow through the skin, they get into the bloodstream, they get into the circulation, but they have to go to the liver for maturation. So they go into the liver for a period of time, and once they're mature, then they leave the liver and they go into the blood vessels. So they are paired. I showed you a picture of them earlier so that the male and female are kind of tied together anatomically. They're not actually joined, but the male is kind of holding the female. Anyway, as I said, they either go into the blood vessels of the gut or they go into the blood vessels associated with the urinary bladder. So here you see the male holding the little female. Actually, you can only see the tips of the female sticking out of that groove. So the male is keeping her close. Anyway, eggs are going to be released, and these eggs are going to leave the body with fecal material. If you're talking about the flukes associated with the gut, the blood vessels of the gut, they're going to leave with urine. We're talking about blood vessels associated with the urinary bladder. The eggs are going to be released. You're going to have a merocydium. The merocydium is going to go into a snail, and then in the snail they form several generations of sporocysts. So the sporocysts of this sac. The cercaria that comes out is very distinctive. The cercariae of blood flukes have forked tails. So we're going to look at these in lab. They're really easy to distinguish from the Fasciola hepatica cercariae. The Fasciola hepatica kind of look like tadpoles. They just have a little straight tail. Well, sometimes it's bent, but it's not forked. The cercaria of schistosome flukes have a distinct forked tail. Maybe it helps them swim more powerfully because they have to burrow through the skin of their host. Here we see eggs of the fluke up in the upper left, and then fluke larvae in tissue. This image is showing a person holding a urine sample, and you can see that that urine is blood colored. At a microbiology conference that I attended at one point, there was an individual that had been to Egypt, specifically in the region of the Aswan Dam, and he said it was very disturbing to see 3 little kids that were standing up on the edge of an irrigation canal, and they were having a contest to see who could pee across this canal. No big deal. 2 of them had blood-colored urine. The littler one didn't, and they thought that there was something wrong with him because his urine was the wrong color. So pretty much everybody's infested with blood flukes and have blood in the urine. This is a pair of legs that have had blood flukes burrow through the skin? Maybe, because there are other types of flukes besides blood flukes that will burrow through the skin like that, and they produce what's called swimmer's edge. Most of them aren't as bad as schistosoma. And then this is the distended belly, which is very common if you have blood flukes associated with the gut, in the blood vessels associated with the gut, sorry. Okay, so those were our flukes. With the flukes, again, flukes, not so much worm-like. Fasciola hepatica looks more like a leaf. They're little flat things. The schistosome flukes look a little bit more worm-like, or you could think of a leaf rolled up. Anyway, now we're moving on to tapeworms. And tapeworms are different because they're going to be long. They're much more worm-like. They're called tapeworms because they typically have a whole series of segments. So kind of like a measuring tape would have a series of segments. Our example is Taenia, and there are 3 species listed here: Taenia solium, Saginata, and Pisiformis. Taenia solium is the pork tapeworm. Taenia saginata is the beef tapeworm. Taenia pisiformis is a dog tapeworm. There are lots of different kinds of these things. Now, these have quite a simpler life cycle because they don't have intermediate hosts. So you have an adult tapeworm, it's living in the gut. They mate. Presumably you have to have 2 different tapeworms to mate, but technically one tapeworm could mate with itself. We'll see why in a bit. Because these things are monoecious, they have both male and female reproductive systems, and they have this big, long extent of worms, so it would be possible for male parts to release sperm that could fertilize female parts further down the line. But anyway, so they're living in the gut. They're going to produce huge numbers of eggs. Basically, the segments of a tapeworm are just packets full of eggs. They're just, they're called proglottids, and they have huge numbers of eggs that are released into the environment. So here we see an image. This is the scolex, the front end of the worm. Again, it's not really a head because they don't have any kind of nervous system. They don't have a brain. They also don't have any kind of GI system, so they don't have a mouth. There's no nose. There's nothing there except the hooks at the end and the suckers which allow it to attach to the body wall. Behind that scolex, there's a little bit of a neck region, and then it begins to form these segments, the proglottids. These are going this way, and then this way, and then this way, and they're becoming progressively more mature. When they're really mature, they look like this, and they're just full of eggs. A single proglottid that has left an animal, this might be a cat tapeworm or a dog tapeworm, this is a proglottid. So they're about the size of a grain of rice, but they're soft, and they have just enough musculature to move a tiny bit. They're really quite disgusting. If you find these things, if you have a pet that has tapeworms, a lot of times you can find these proglottids loose. There we see some on the left. They're on the tail of an animal, so they've left the gut and they've come out and they're hanging on the hair. There's a couple of them sitting on a piece of fabric, so you might find them on your bedspread if you had a cat that had tapeworm. And here's some proglottids in. So these are just segments, and they're constantly being shed. The worm is holding on to the intestinal wall with its scolex, and the proglottids are maturing down the line, and then they just break off and they're released. These things can survive in the gut for a long period of time. And microbiologists used to infect themselves with tapeworms to study them so they could learn about how long do they survive and so forth. So they know that they can live for years. Anyway, so these things, the eggs are released into the environment, and a lot of times tapeworm eggs can be accidentally ingested. If you think about the pork tapeworm, it's pretty easy to understand how this could happen. There's eggs from proglottids in fecal material. If you've ever watched pigs, they're walking all around in their pen. Somebody gives them some food. They run over to the trough and put their feet in it. Well, so they just put poop in their food, and then they consume that food. That's one way that eggs could be ingested. But another way that's really common, if fecal material is deposited on a trail or on a roadway, that material dries out, and the proglottids are mashed, and the eggs are released, and they become airborne. And then it's really easy for people to accidentally ingest them. At any rate, they the eggs are ingested, they're going to travel to the intestine, they're going to hatch, and they're going to form a larval worm type. These larvae then leave the intestine, they burrow through the gut wall, and they form what's called a cyst. Again, the cyst is a dormant structure, someplace in tissue. With pork tapeworms and beef tapeworms, typically if the sheep or the cow ingests tapeworm eggs accidentally, then typically these larvae are going to be in their muscle tissue. So they are going to be in what you would think of as meat. There's some muscle tissue of cow or sheep, or excuse me, cow or pig, and you see these encysted larvae. You wouldn't maybe see them. Sometimes you find these in fish. You can find them in various different types of animal meat, which is why if you're going to eat meat, cook it. Well, anyway, so these cysts can then just sit there, and what's going to happen is some other animal is going to come along and eat that meat. If the meat is ingested raw or poorly cooked, then the cysts are consumed, and those are going to then mature, and you start the cycle all over again. So the thing is back in the gut. Now, this is showing meat. Again, if you're going to eat meat, well, if you don't know for sure that that meat couldn't have tapeworms associated with it, cook it. In the middle, we see the little tapeworm, again, mostly the scolex with a few segments behind. And then these are proglottids in fecal material. Notice this looks like it's on a roadway. So it could be sitting there, it's going to dry out, it's going to be pulverized, and then it's really easy for those eggs to become airborne. So here's the typical life cycle. Notice that humans are in there, but humans are kind of an accidental host. If humans, well, humans would typically acquire this worm by eating raw or poorly cooked meat. So what they're ingesting is the cyst form, the larval form. Then they're going to have the adult worm in their system. The adult worms are going to produce eggs that are going to be released into the environment, and so this cycle can be completed. But humans don't necessarily have to ingest the encysted larvae with meat. So you can get it by eating raw or poorly cooked meat, but you can also get it by accidentally ingesting eggs. Oh, I stuck this in here. This supposedly used to be something that physicians would do for their overweight patients, is prescribe tapeworm eggs. Actually, they couldn't have been tapeworm eggs, because if you ingest tapeworm eggs, what you're going to get is tapeworm larvae burrowing into your tissue. So what they had to give them were tapeworm cysts, the immature form. Exactly how they did that, I don't know. But supposedly good for weight loss. If you have 2 or 3 tapeworms living in your gut, they're taking up nutrient that you don't get to use. And apparently they live for several years. But you can acquire them by accidentally ingesting eggs. And as I said, this can happen fairly readily, where you have humans and animals living in close proximity, fecal materials being deposited on roadways and trails, becomes dry and pulverized, the eggs get into the air. If humans ingest the eggs, then what's going to happen is those eggs are going to hatch into larvae that burrow through the gut wall and go into tissue. For some reason in humans, they tend not to go into muscle tissue. Instead, they tend to go into the brain or into the eyes. There you can see an eye with a tiny little cyst. See this? But there are a wide variety of tapeworms, and some of them can produce a cyst that's about this big around. That kind of a cyst will kill you. So, yeah, it's kind of scary to think about some of the parasites that exist. Huh? The tapeworm that does that, the cyst is called a hydatid cyst, and I can't remember the name of the tapeworm, but it's a dog parasite. Anyway, now, so those were in the phylum Platyhelminthes, the flatworms, the flukes, and the tapeworms. Now we're moving into the next phylum, which is the phylum Ashhelminthes, also called Nemahelminthes or Nematoda. Our first example is the hookworm. Nicator americanus is the name for what we call the New World hookworm, so it's our local variety. And then there's Ancylostoma duodenale, which is the Old World hookworm. They are generally going to have very similar life cycles. So hookworm adults live in the intestine, and they're attached to the inside of the intestinal wall They could have a good nutrient supply in the intestine, but they actually feed on blood. So they're going to be hooked into the intestinal wall, and they're feeding on blood. They are dioecious. I don't know of any roundworms that aren't. So the roundworms tend to be dioecious. That means separate sexes. So they're going to mate, and the females are going to release eggs. Here you can see hookworms attached to the gut wall. So these things are not very big. An adult hookworm is only about maybe a centimeter at most. They're not real big. The eggs are definitely microscopic. So they're releasing eggs. The eggs are going to exit in fecal material. They're going to be deposited in the environment. If conditions are right, and the conditions that are ideal for hookworm development is warm and moist. So these tend to be associated with tropical environments. Again, a concern about climate change because tropical environments are potentially spreading. Anyway, these are released into the soil. For a period of time, these larval worms just move about feeding on bacteria. There's lots of bacteria in the soil, and so they can survive there quite nicely. They reach a certain stage of development, and then they want to find a new host. Like the blood flukes, these guys burrow through the skin. They prefer skin that's fairly soft, so they might go between the toes on people walking around barefooted. Small children, probably any soft skin. They're sitting in the dirt, they're walking in the dirt, they can easily pick up hookworms. Once they get in, these larvae get into the bloodstream, they circulate for a short period of time, and for some reason then they detect changes in the oxygen levels within blood. They will leave the bloodstream and go into the lung. From the lung, then they go from the alveoli into the airway. So they go from the bronchioles to the bronchi to the trachea, and eventually they reach the pharynx. Our pharynx is an intersection between respiratory system and gastrointestinal system. So they're coming up the airway. They tickle a little bit, so the person coughs and swallows, and the hookworm get back into the gut, which is where they want to go. So they create a little bit of a tickling sensation, and people would cough just a little bit, just enough to, move them, and then swallow them, and then you have the adults eventually maturing within the gut, and then they mate and they start the whole cycle over again. So here we see the cycle. This one's pretty simple. There isn't no intermediate host. We just have eggs leaving the definitive host, hatching into larvae that are in the soil, and then they're going to burrow through the skin of their new host. So those are fun. Hookworms. Now, this mentions there are hookworms that are not, where humans are not the definitive host. There are hookworms that normally infect dogs. In regions where you have a lot of dogs and they're depositing fecal material in places where people frequent, oftentimes beaches, those hookworms can burrow through the skin of humans, but then they get lost. Instead of going into the bloodstream and circulating to the lung, they just crawl around under the skin, and they cause what's called creeping eruption. If you've ever had this experience, it's exceedingly irritating because those things don't go away. They just go around in circles just under your skin. They're very itchy, extremely irritating, and as far as I know, the only way to control them is to hit them with liquid nitrogen and kill them on the spot. Of course, it also creates a big blister on the surface of your skin. So, our next parasite is called Trichinella spiralis. Again, the ones that I'm giving you here in lecture are predominantly ones that we have prepared slides for, so you get to see them in your slide boxes. This is the roundworm that causes trichinosis, Trichinella spiralis. The adult worms live in the intestine. Again, they are dioecious, so they have separate sexes. They mate, and the female release live larvae. Even though they're in the gut, their larvae are released into the bloodstream. They travel about for a bit, and then they burrow off into tissue, and they form cysts. This is I believe, the reason for the name Trichinella spiralis. This is the spirally looking worm larvae in muscle tissue. This is a cross section. This is also a cross section, but depending upon the orientation of this little spiral thing, you see cross sections of the worm in places. In our slide sets that are in the boxes, there are these cross sections through tissue, and then for some reason, people started replacing them. with prepared slides that have muscle tissue that has been made semi-transparent so you can see the whole worm in there. I don't think you can see it as well as you can in these cross sections. But anyway, what we're looking at are these coiled up, spiral-looking, encysted larvae. Well, so then how do they get transmitted to the next host? Somebody has to eat that meat raw or poorly cooked. There are historically, what do I want to say? There are groups of people that were told, don't eat pork. Do not eat pork. And the reason was because some people that I ate pork ate it raw and it killed them. And this is why. So Trichinella spiralis has the potential of killing you. If you eat meat that has these larvae in it, then those larvae are going to hatch in your intestine, and then they're going to mate, and they're going to produce more larvae that burrow through your intestinal wall and go into your muscle tissue. If they do that, they're taking bacteria from the gut into your muscle tissue, into the body cavity, wherever they go, and this can cause severe damage. So you can have tremendous inflammations, inflammatory reactions, a lot of pain, swelling, fever, etc. This is called, the condition was called trichinosis, and it killed people. Probably in the United States currently, if you eat pork, it's probably raised in a commercial setting where the pigs are not eating raw or poorly cooked meat themselves, and so it's highly unlikely that they would have meat that would be infected. It's if you buy meat that's been raised on a farm someplace and you don't know what people have been feeding the pigs. If they're fed meat scraps, then they could have trichinella in their tissue. And I don't think you would necessarily see those larvae in there. Again, this is a parasite that if the larvae were in human muscle tissue and the human survived, that's probably the end of the line for the parasite because there's not that much ingestion of human flesh. Probably a good thing. The next example is Dirofilaria immitis. Dirofilaria is the canine heartworm. So the primary host for Dirofilaria is dogs. That's why it's called canine heartworm. However, Dirofilaria can also infect other animals, including cats and humans. There's a lot of different types. It says over 30 different types of animals can be infected. The adult worms inhabit the heart and also the blood vessels near the heart, the pulmonary vessels. This image shows a heart that is literally filled with these adult worms. They look like a hairball inside there, and you can imagine that that is really going to interfere with circulation. They can kill animals, generally due to congestive heart failure. They simply cannot get blood through that mass. Now, if you have adult worms in the blood vessels and in the heart, they're going to mate. The females release larvae that are called microfilariae, which means they're microscopic roundworms, and they're going to be in the bloodstream. They're going to be available then for a vector, in this case a mosquito. The mosquito bites an animal that has microfilaria in the bloodstream. The mosquito transmits the microfilaria to a new host, and the larvae get into the region of the heart and mature, and the cycle starts over again. So in this case, we see two images of the microfilariae. This is what our prepared slides look like. So you see this kind of blurry material in the background. Those are mostly red blood cells. Over here, some white blood cells. And this is Dirofilaria. They are stained purple, so they're really easy to see. And then, of course, this is the mosquito vector that can transmit. So the veterinary community is very concerned about canine heartworm, predominantly because it kills dogs, but also because it can infect other types of animals, cats and humans. And so they try really hard to get people to treat. And primarily, I think what's used for that is ivermectin, which is given in a little cube form of material that dogs like, and you just feed it to them. There's a treatment for cats now called Paradigm that also is supposed to treat for canine heartworm in cats to prevent canine heartworm. So this is talking about those microfilariae. If they're in the bloodstream, they can be in the bloodstream for up to a year. It's going to take a long time for them to reach maturity. And then the adults can survive for 5 to 7 years if they don't kill their host before that. Again, humans can be infected. Usually humans don't get worms in their heart. Instead, they tend to get parasites in the lung, and they cause granulomas that can be mistaken for lung cancer. There's another type of Dirofilaria called Dirofilaria ripens. We don't have this one on our slide box, but I found this and I thought they were kind of interesting. These are typically, again, parasites of dogs and cats. They can infect humans, and they tend to just move around under the skin in humans. They don't mature properly. And so here we see some examples. In this case, this thing is in an eyelid. You can see it just under the skin. Here it is in the eye. This one's coming out of somebody's face. You won't look at those, that one image that's on the left. It's like, is that Photoshop? I don't know. There are some tremendous parasite images. You Google parasites, and there are some crazy Photoshop images. So don't believe everything you see out there. Now here's another parasite called Ascaris lumbricoides. I think we have one of these in the cupboard. I never know where they go. Maybe I can find it. These things are about 8 to 10 inches long when they're adults. They're big worms. And again, they have a relatively simple life cycle. If you have adult Ascaris worms living in your gut, they are separate sexes. They're dioecious. Males and females mate. The females produce huge numbers of eggs that exit the host in fecal material. Again, fecal material deposited in an area where it can be walked on or driven on, it's going to dry out, the eggs become airborne, people ingest the eggs. Accidental, but it happens a lot. When those eggs are ingested, the larvae go through an interesting cycle. You swallow them, they burrow through the gut wall, they get in the bloodstream, they travel around to the lung, again, they go up the airway, get in the pharynx, get swallowed, and then you have these things back in your gut. Like, why did they go through this crazy cycle? I don't know. But anyway, this is telling us that hundreds of millions of people have Ascaris worms. In other parts of the world, this is just kind of an assumed everybody has parasites. It's like everybody's infected with parasites. Most of the time, there's no symptoms whatsoever. In this country, because a lot of people that live in this country travel, a lot of times people travel to foreign places and they come back and they have Ascaris infections, but they don't know it until they have some kind of an interesting event. For some reason, these adult worms can become migratory and they will crawl up from the gut, through the stomach, up the esophagus, and come out somebody's mouth or nose. I had a student that brought one in one semester, and she said her neighbor gave it to her. She said, the neighbor said he woke up, he was having a dream, he was chewing on a rubber band. And he woke up, and sure enough, there was something rubbery in his mouth. So he got a pair of tweezers and pulled it out. It was a worm about this long. Other people working in clinical settings have reported they've seen these things come out the nose of a child or something like that. It's a horrific experience to have these things migrate. Otherwise, you'd probably never know you had them.
They can also come up from your butt too.
They come out of your butt too? Doesn't surprise me. And they're big.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty shocking, huh? It's very disturbing when that happens. Like, oh my word. Now these are much more common in this country, and probably many people have experienced these. Anaerobius vermicularis, this is the pinworm. Pinworms are tiny as adults, a little bitty roundworms. They live in the colon, so they're living in the large intestine. The females, when they have mated, the females come to the anal opening to lay their eggs. So they come out and they lay their eggs right around the anus. Apparently one way to detect, to find out if somebody is infected with pinworms is to use Scotch tape, and you can catch the eggs if you just tap it around the anus. Anyway, so they lay their eggs. Here you can see pinworms in the image on the left, and then at the anal opening you can see pinworms right here. And here's an innocent child thinking, something itches. Well, so when the pinworms lay their eggs, it causes an itching sensation. Small children will scratch something that itches, they get pinworm eggs under their fingernails, and then those get scattered all over the house. And then everybody has pinworms. Adult people generally find these in diapers. It's like, how do you know somebody's infected? Oh, because you get a diaper load and then you've got worms in because it's in the fecal material. Yeah, lots of fun. Anyway, so then everybody has to be treated. You can imagine these tiny eggs that get scattered about. They're going to be easily picked up accidentally and ingested. And as I said, if somebody in the family has pinworms, pretty soon everybody in the family has pinworms, and everybody has to be treated. We don't have either one of these, not the Ascaris or the Anaerobius in our slide set, but I thought you should learn about them. And then this last one, this is a particularly interesting one. Dracunculus medinensis. This is the guinea worm, and the guinea worm is a nasty parasite. This parasite involves an intermediate host, which is an organism called copepod, which is a little crustacean that lives in water. So they're called water fleas. Anyway, the water fleas apparently ingest the eggs of the parasites, and so they have a larval stage inside them. And people get this by drinking water that has these water fleas in it. So what you see in this image, you see people collecting water. If you don't have running water in your home, you get water where you can get it. And in some places, water is very limited. But these folks, what you'll notice is they have these straws. These aren't just straws. These are straws that have a filter across one end that won't allow the copepods to go through. And so they can safely drink that water and not get guinea worm infection. This is a really simple method for preventing guinea worm infection. Just don't drink water that has copepods in it. If you drink water with copepods, the copepods, after they're ingested, they can't survive going through the stomach, so they die. But they're going to release the larval worms. And these larval worms then go through the stomach wall, and they get into the abdominal cavity, sometimes in the retroperitoneal space, so sometimes in the back near the kidneys, and they mature there. So maturation is going to take us several months, and then they're going to mate, and then the males die because they don't have any significant role to play anymore. Their bodies get absorbed. But the females hang about, and they can stay in there for quite some time, so maybe a year or more. The females eventually begin to migrate toward the surface of the skin, and what they're going to do is try to release their eggs, and they want to put their eggs back into a water environment. They create these blisters on the surface of the skin. When the blister ruptures, the end of the worm emerges, and then people would try to submerge that limb in water because water will cool it and make it somewhat less painful. But the bad news is, if you submerge that in water, then the female is going to be releasing eggs, which is not good. This would restart the cycle because the worm eggs would go back in the water where they get eaten by the copepod, and you just start the cycle over again. So what has been done, what we're trying to do to stop this, or I should say what people are trying to do to stop this, is again prevent people from accidentally ingesting these copepods, using filters to filter the water and so forth. You see these images. This is a worm, the adult female, that is being removed from the skin. However, you can't just pull that thing out because this worm extends several feet. And so it has to be removed very carefully, slowly. They wind them onto a stick, and it takes several days to get them out. Okay, so this is an extremely painful lesion that is produced when this worm comes to the surface, but there can be other symptoms associated. Not surprisingly, you have an open wound, you can get secondary bacterial infection. So you're going to get fever, nausea, vomiting, sometimes allergic reactions, diarrhea, etc., etc. It's going to take a long time to get that worm out, and then the healing process can begin. So again, this is a nasty parasite. Here you see people at various stages of having these worm larvae, the worm adult female removed. And then there's a little short video here.
Oh, yes. I'm so excited.
Come on, play. Aw. Oh, come on. Oh, it won't play.
Oh. Click the link. Click the link. We need to see it.
Yeah, I could put the link up there.
Well, the link is there. Yeah, it's right there at the bottom.
Yeah. it usually plays, I don't know why it won't.
Divine intervention.
No, it won't go. Divine intervention, come on. Anyway, this is a film, it is talking about what the Carter Foundation has done to try to control guinea worm. So what they have done is try to get everybody to only drink water that has been filtered. So, and they've tried to install wells so people can have fresh water. If people are gonna be nomadic and they're drinking water out in the wild, then they carry these straws that have the filters on them so that they are not gonna ingest the cocoa pods and get the infection. The film does show worms being pulled out, and it gives you a pretty good idea of how devastating this is, this infection, because a lot of small children have these worms that are trying to be removed. They don't really understand what's going on, except that it hurts like the son of a gun. They have significantly reduced the amount of Dracunculus that exists, but there's always a few, and this has become problematic because a lot of the regions where these exist, the governments are not entirely stable, and it's really difficult for people to get in there and educate the natives about what they need to do to not get that parasite. And I apologize, the film won't run.
Try again.
Well, it is trying, but it's not.
Copy and paste the link to the website.
And it's not going. I could do that. Just won't go. I don't know why. You're not even gonna try. Wow, the good news is I have another film to show you guys. So there's lots of other parasites that infect humans. So this is just, just a smattering. I have a whole film about parasites that I would like to show you. And I'm not sure how best to go about this, and so I thought, I'm gonna go ahead and put this into lecture time and push into our lab time just a little bit if I can get it to run. So we're gonna exit this computer and go to a different computer.
I hear super frizzy now.
If you really need to take a break, you can run away while I get my other computer set up.
For that last one, you were talking about it wasn't in the notes, but do we need to know that for the exam?
Yes.
No.
I would have a hard time with this. Oh, yeah.
At this point, how about you guys take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll start the lab, and if I can get my husband to bring the dongle over, I'll show you the film.
He's just across the street, right?
Yeah, he's across the street. He loves having me call him and ask him, can you please bring me?
So, she's in a doctor, so we're taking a 15-minute break.